So far, we've been talking quite a bit about various philosophical issues related to death, whether death is bad for the person who dies, whether immortality would be attractive for us, and if so, under what conditions. And then we moved into thinking a little bit about how to define death, and specifically how to define death uh, within a medical context. And we saw that there's some sort of interesting, deep philosophical problems there. And now we want to sort of continue uh, in that vein of thinking about death as an issue that comes up in medicine quite frequently, um, and look more closely at cases not necessarily of death, but cases where individuals are clearly dying, where they have some sort of terminal condition, treatment is not proving to be beneficial, death is imminent. These are cases that are typically referred to as cases of medical futility, where treatment is more or less non-beneficial. It's sort of the generic way to think about it. And there are a few reasons that this is interesting. One of the reasons this is interesting, I think, is because these are cases that really challenge the idea that what's most important in medicine, the most important value, is patient autonomy. Because these are cases where patients are often requesting treatment that is very expensive, that uses a significant amount of medical resources, and that sort of the trade-off, what you get out of it, is pretty minimal. So that's one reason that we're gonna think about this, is that it's sort of, these sorts of cases place a heavy burden on our sort of healthcare infrastructure, and they really challenge some of the core values that medicine deals with. So that's one reason that we're gonna take a look at it. And another reason that we're going to look at it is a little bit deeper and a little bit more closely connected to our focus on philosophical issues related to death and dying. We saw in the previous module that one of the reasons it's important that physicians have a working sort of functional definition of death is that physicians have certain obligations to living persons. And those obligations cease once the person has died. And you might think that so long as the person is still alive, those obligations persist. But these medical futility cases really sort of put pressure on that idea, because these are cases where there's really a live debate still ongoing about whether physicians are still obligated to provide this kind of care, or perhaps obligated not to provide it. We're going to see an argument later about whether physicians are maybe even obligated not to offer it, not to even sort of suggest it as a possibility. So again, fetal care, what we're talking about here is roughly just care that's non-beneficial. And we're asking questions about whether a person's status as, dying, as being in this position of where their medical case is more or less futile, is treatment is non-beneficial, whether that has any effect on the obligations that physicians have, as well as any effect on the obligations that we have. And one thing that we're going to notice in looking at this issue is that futility can actually be a pretty complicated concept. I mean, physicians today and medicine today has actually moved away from the term medical futility, and they just describe these as cases where treatment is non-beneficial. And they sort of seem to think that this has fixed the problem, and that they're no longer sort of doing all the troubling things that talking about futility involves. But it's, as you're going to notice as we work through this, you'll see that that's not really true. They're just sort of using a different word to describe the same sort of thing. One thing we want to start with here is just looking at different ways that we can understand futility, because it turns out that there are quite a few, and what sort of futility we're talking about is going to make a difference for maybe how we feel about particular cases. So let's start there and just look at different ways futility can be understood. First, and this is taken from the piece by Stuart Younger, first of all, futility can be understood physiologically. So the idea here is just that care would be futile when it's going to have no observable physiological effect. So for example, if you take an antibiotic for the flu, which is a viral infection, the antibiotic is a physiologically futile treatment. It's not going to have any sort of observable physiological effect, at least on the condition that you're taking it for. Things will happen in your body, but they won't in any way alter physiologically the impact of the virus. We can also understand futility a different way, though. We can understand it in terms of postponing death. Now, the idea here is just that care would be futile if the patient's death occurs at exactly the same time that it would have occurred if we had not done the intervention. So the intervention doesn't in any way sort of push death off. We can also understand futility in terms of prolonging a person's life. Now here, Jünger does something a little bit strange, but he wants to distinguish this from postponing death by putting it in terms of care being futile when the patient dies without being able to leave the hospital. So we might think that if care maybe has some physiological effects, maybe it postpones the patient's death to some extent, but it doesn't ever allow them to leave the hospital, we want to say that that's futile because it doesn't extend their life as far as outside of the hospital is concerned. We can also understand futility in terms of quality of life. This is probably the notion of futility that a lot of people think of when they're thinking about these kinds of cases. This is just, the idea here is just that care would be futile when it fails to allow the patient to achieve some important goal that they have or fulfill some desire of theirs. Like if the patient really wants to pursue a course of treatment because they want to walk again, and then they never do, that care would be futile because, in this quality of life sense, because it did not lead them to achieving that goal. And last but not least, we can understand futility in terms of probability. The thought here is that care can be futile when it's just unlikely, sort of low probability of bringing out the desired outcome, whatever it may be. Now, one thing that you should immediately notice here, and that's going to be an important sort of ongoing theme in working through this issue, is that only the first two of these are sort of strictly empirical evaluations and strictly kind of medical assessments. The others all involve some kind of value judgment, right? Because I can measure physiologically whether a treatment is doing anything in your body. I can sort of observe that. And whether a treatment has sort of postponed your death, I can just compare when I thought you were going to die with when you actually died and see if they're the same. And if they are, then the treatment was futile. If they're not, then the treatment wasn't. But length of life involves a value judgment because it sort of assumes that continuing to live but being in the hospital is not worthwhile. Quality of life clearly involves value judgments because it's based on certain kinds of goals or desires being fulfilled. And probability is going to be a value judgment because we're making a decision about what sort of what percentage or what sort of level of likelihood is insufficient to justify a treatment protocol. Now, because on the one hand you might think that, unless treatment increases my chance of survival by 60%, it's futile. It's not worth anything. It's non-beneficial. And then you might think that no, if it's anything over 10 or 15%, it's worthwhile. There's a value judgment there because you're making a decision about kind of what probability is high enough to justify giving a treatment a try. And this is important because the term futile implies that the treatment in question is somehow not worth it, that it's worthless or valueless. And what we want to notice here is just that a lot of that determination is grounded in certain kinds of value assessments and not necessarily in just sort of the medical facts. There are a lot of cases where a treatment wouldn't be futile in these sort of physiological sense or in terms of postponing death, but we still can ask a question of whether it's really worthwhile. And those are the hard cases. Those are the cases that are going to be most difficult for medicine and for physicians to sort of deal with. So that's just sort of an introduction to the concept of futility. That's going to come up again a bit more as we work through this because some of the pieces we're going to look at are going to have their own views about what futility really amounts to. Some people are going to sort of challenge this. But in general, we're going to see this ongoing sharp distinction between medical futility, which is sort of captured by these first two kinds of futility, and what you might call normative futility, these sort of value-based futility cases. And let's just conclude by identifying what I think of as the guiding questions for the module. I think this will help us to have a good sense of what we're doing here, because there are a lot of sort of moving parts with this issue, so it can get a little bit tricky. We're basically going to be guided by three questions. First, the question of whether patients have a right to futile treatment, and if so, what sort of futile treatment, so what level of futile treatment is an entitlement for patients. Is it just the sort of normatively futile kind, or is it the medically futile kind too? And are there sort of cases where facts about the case makes a difference. We're also going to ask whether physicians can justifiably deny fetal care, and if so, under what conditions they might be allowed to do that. And finally, we're going to look at who ought to make the decision that a course of treatment is futile, because you might think that we can have sort of rules and principles about futile treatment, but there's still this problem of determining when a course of treatment actually would be futile, and we can sort of ask who should be in charge of that choice. And I want to just conclude by briefly reiterating why this is potentially an interesting question to ask in a course about death and dying. Because on the one hand, you might think this is just a straightforward medical ethics problem. It's a question about what autonomy entitles patients to, what sort of right to treatment patients have, what sort of right to refuse physicians have, and it's just sort of coincidental that we're talking about people with these sort of terminal, untreatable conditions. You might also think that what's really going on here is a challenge to this general idea that so long as a patient is alive, physicians have certain kinds of obligations to them. Because it's really only because these folks are dying, sort of in a very active way, they're sort of actively moving towards their death, and they're not far from it. It's only because of that there's even a question here, right? I mean, in cases where an individual is not where their death is not imminent, in those kinds of cases, we don't even ask these kinds of questions, right? We don't even sort of consider whether physicians can, not provide certain kinds of treatment. We sort of think that if the patient wants it, they're entitled to it. So it's really only because we're talking about individuals who are actively dying that we're asking questions about our obligations to them. Okay, so the question is going to ask you a little bit about how we can understand futility, and specifically what sort of notions of futility don't involve value judgments, and then we'll move on to looking at some of these specific arguments from the articles.